I thought it was important to have a non-ideologically driven yet powerful discussion on the topic of 9/11 since another anniversary has come by. I wanted this to be a conversation that everyone, no matter what side, if you will, of the 9/11 narrative that you're on, you could listen to it and really enjoy it and take something out of it. So we decided to do that. We decided to have this conversation. 9/11 has been one of the most catalyzing events in the world. Probably in recent history, it's been one of the events that has caused so much in terms of a war on terror, but at the same time, it has created things like the Patriot Act, which has taken away liberties from the American people. But at the same time, regardless of all that, it has also had so many people begin questioning mainstream narratives around current events. You could say that 9/11 has caused so many people to break the illusion, as we call it here at CE, and start asking questions about what's really going on in our world. No matter how you look at it, 9/11 has had a deep impact on our collective consciousness. So here we are, another year, another anniversary of 9/11 has come by, and I decided to have a conversation, a discussion with my friend Dr. Madhava Setty. He has a great inquisitive mind, a ton of wisdom, and he's done extensive research on the topic of 9/11. So I thought this was going to be a great conversation to really explore this from a non-ideological point of view.
9/11 is a very special one. I truly see it as the glitch in the matrix.
Madhava wrote one of the most hard-hitting articles, very concise as well, on the topic of 9/11 on our website back in 2019. He took a very unique approach to the piece, and he extensively looked at the 9/11 report prepared by NIST. It examined whether or not the conclusions made by that report could in fact be true. And this approach made this piece so powerful. So in this discussion, we'll carry over that unique approach from that article to explore this topic more deeply, but we're also going to relate it to today, to right now, this current COVID pandemic that's going on, and discuss how a lot of what's happening or what happened out of 9/11 is potentially happening today, which makes this conversation not only relevant to today's anniversary, but at the same time to today's current events. So enjoy this interview. So part of what I wanted to talk about here was, I know you've done a lot of research on the topic of 9/11, which people might ask the question now. It's like, okay, yeah, the 9/11 anniversary is here. However, 9/11 in a lot of ways relates to what we're currently going through with this pandemic in a number of ways as well. Specifically with rights and authoritarian measures and various narratives that don't quite add up, that we're having a difficult time really coming to as a humanity right now. And thus, it's a very important time. So I thought we would use this anniversary here of 9/11 to not only discuss a little bit about some of your extensive research on 9/11, but also to discuss how it pertains to our current events of today and COVID-19. And I think one of the best ways to begin is just share a little bit of your background as an anesthesiologist, which is like, okay, how do you go from anesthesiology to diving into 9/11 in a sense, in a deep way? But I want to know, like, how is that of interest to you, and what got you inspired to, I guess, start writing about this and start talking about this?
Yeah. Well, before going into medicine, I was an engineer, and I've worked on defense contracts in the United States for years, lots of simulations, modeling of rigid bodies and forces. So I have a background in engineering and math, but I'm going to take you back a little bit further because I'm old enough to remember when the buildings were built, when the Twin Towers came up in New York City in 1971. And when I was about 7 years old, my parents took me there. And I remember going up to these iconic structures as, a 4'6" kid, and just like trying to embrace these buildings as if they were a tree. And you look up, it goes 1,300 feet in the air straight up. And people don't realize this, this was a very different kind of building, these Twin Towers. They had, girders and steel on the outside. It was like a fortress. Both of these buildings were a fortress. And I could not help just falling in love with these buildings. And then a few years later, we went back and had a cup of coffee on this restaurant at the top of the world, I think it was called. So I've always sort of had this connection to the Twin Towers, and I wanted to be an architect all my life, but ended up going into engineering. But to answer your question, how did this, launch an investigation into 9/11? And to be honest with you, and I know you woke up to the possibility of another story around 9/11 a lot longer before I did, but it was in 2017, and my wife showed me a 30-second clip of a building that most people do not know that went down in Manhattan exactly, 19 years ago tomorrow. And it's called Building 7, also known as the Salomon Brothers Building, a building that was not hit by a plane that went down at 5:20 p.m. that day. And immediately you have to stop and say, wait a second, because that building went down like this at the speed of gravity, 400 feet across, 47 stories high. The building was younger than the Twin Towers. It was not hit by a plane, and it fell as fast as if you were standing on top of the building when it went down, you would have hit the ground just as fast as dropping a rock. That means that several 100,000 tons of structural components put up no resistance anywhere. It didn't go like this, it didn't fall over, it went straight down. That looks exactly like a controlled demolition. Yeah. So it took me 15 minutes of going into my office and looking at, some maths and physics. And I was like, there's no way that this could have happened that way. And then I spent the next 2 weeks researching the 9/11 Commission report and the supporting technical documents from NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, to try to talk myself out of it, because I couldn't believe it. I thought for sure that I must be missing something, and I couldn't do it. So that's how it all opened up. And yeah.
And I think what's you wrote an article for Collective Evolution there on the site, and it's one of the most, I guess, succinct and clear listings of some of the hardest hitting points, I would say. When you're looking at the NIST report and you're looking at the things that have happened in real life that you can see on video, that you have access to, that everybody can observe. I think in one of the videos where the scientist is speaking, that's part of the article, he says, the first part of science is actually observing with our eyes, and then we kind of study from there, right? And when you observe, just like you did, the World Trade Center 7, or even the building 1 and 2 there, that came down in a similar fashion, not quite free fall, but pretty similar. One of the things, as I was reviewing the article again, but before jumping on here, is a lot of the discussions around explosives, right? And the video evidence supports it, right? When we look at it, we can see that you have these squibs shooting out. But let's dive into this a little bit. Like these buildings coming down and the idea of explosives. The NIST report does not even entertain the idea of explosives. What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Joe, you got right down to the crux of the matter. First of all, I want to thank you and Collective Evolution for having the temerity to run that piece. And it is a different kind of piece on 9/11, because I found out very quickly that this is not a matter of getting enough evidence behind a controlled demolition. This is a matter of psychology. We cannot see it. We refuse to see it. And there are a lot of reasons for that. But to answer your question, what's fascinating here is it looks just like a controlled demolition. But how are you going to prove that it was? The scientific approach to looking at the demolition of these buildings is to, as you said, what do you observe? It looks just like a controlled demolition. Why wouldn't they check for evidence, which would have been very easy to find in the dust, of explosive residues? Moreover, we have 118 firefighters from New York who have gone on public record saying that they heard explosions. Yeah. we have probably, a dozen or more media sources that morning who reported hearing explosions. The scientific approach would have been to rule out explosives first, and then, if there are none there, find another explanation. So we are forced now to reconcile the fact that this scientific committee, comprised of the greatest minds in applied mathematics, science, and metallurgy, decided not to look for explosives.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that? So to answer the question is, we have to stop and say, what would have happened if they found explosives? How would that change everything? They would be forced to come up with, why would planes be flown into the buildings and the fact that they're explosives?
Yeah.
That would lead us down a very, very difficult path, if you carry out the logic.
Right.
If there were planes and explosives, why were the planes being flown into the buildings if the terrorists could have just pushed a button?
Yeah.
It would obviously, well, I don't want to say obviously, but logic dictates then that the planes must have been a decoy.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And now juxtapose that with the fact that they veered away from all scientific,
Rigor.
approach. Yeah, rigor.
Yeah.
And not look for the explosives. So again, Joe, you know this better than I do. You cannot tell people what to believe.
Mm-hmm.
We have to invite a spirit of inquiry, so that people can come to their own conclusions. And so, far be it from me to say that, oh, I know they were blown up, but let's just look at the logic here. Why would this institution not look for explosive evidence? Because, we both know that, independent researchers have shown that there was explosive residues in the dust. But now we're making an argument that says, trust me and my sources, don't trust them. There's no reason for someone to believe you or to believe me or to believe the third party source, which is why, I think the article that you ran a year ago is very, very interesting, because I don't ask anyone to trust a third party source. I just examine the internal inconsistencies of what we've been told and what mainstream media has said. You don't need to have a third party dissect this for you. The media themselves, or the narrative that's been suggested to us, is incredibly hypocritical, mm-hmm. inconsistent.
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because it's one of those things where there are inconsistencies, there are issues with the official story from top to bottom, and it seemed, especially early on in the early years, anytime people asked questions, it was always ridiculed, right? It was always, how dare you ask that question? How dare you challenge the families or the people who've lost somebody, the firefighters or the police officers and so forth that lost their lives on this particular day. And that was always the approach that media took, that politicians took. I remember a clip of Bill Clinton saying, how dare you, when somebody had asked him at a public speech that he was giving, hey, what his thoughts were on 9/11. He just said, how dare you? He didn't bother to address anything. And these were the early days of this whole thing. And from your perspective of seeing the NIST report and seeing how flimsy it was, do you think that was a coordinated effort to just ridicule because they didn't know what to say? What are your feelings on how politicians were responding to this?
Well, with regard to politicians, I think the most important aspect of this is to recall the statements that George W. Bush made at the United Nations on November 10th, 2001, less than 2 months after the buildings fell. Mm-hmm. And, to paraphrase what he said, it was something like, let us not be taken by people who are spreading lies, conspiracy theories away from the truth. And this was a very bold statement. because if we, look at what a conspiracy theory is, it is basically a label that you give to a theory that has no supporting evidence. That is what Wikipedia calls it, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we have to stop and say, wait a minute, how can an explanation that has no evidence be called a theory? That's called a hypothesis. So there's a misnomer going on there. But more importantly, once something gets labeled a conspiracy theory, we internally say, oh, it's a batty idea. It has no evidence. The reality is that the NIST report, the final report, didn't come out until 2008, 7 years later. 2 months after what happened, he's already calling it a conspiracy theory.
Mm-hmm.
He's biasing our consciousness into just dismissing anyone who challenges a narrative that really is not based in any science yet.
Yeah.
I think that was the most devastating blow to direct inquiry, is to have the president of the United States, who is enjoying the greatest popularity in his 2 terms. Everybody was united behind him. Why is he calling it out?
Yeah.
60 days after the event, like, don't believe anyone who says that our story is wrong. That right away should give us reason to pause. You mentioned something very interesting about NIST, for example. How do you get a institution of tremendous scientists to come up with this ad hoc, inexplicably poor scientific study when they're paid to answer the hardest questions?
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know if what your thoughts on that. I don't want to steal your thunder, but it's a real important question to answer if you're keeping an open mind. How do you coerce scientists? This is a paradigm that is we have to question right now, because we're hearing a lot of evidence from the scientists. And we just simply grant them presumptive legitimacy because they're scientists. And if we are to assume that the NIST scientists could be coerced, how could it have been done?
Mm-hmm.
And we're speculating.
Yeah.
Right? We're speculating. The first, strategy, I would say, is that you give NIST an extremely specific directive. NIST was not asked to explain how the buildings came down. This is what people don't understand. We think, NIST and 9/11 Commission, they explain how the buildings come down. No, they did not. What they did do was suggest how it could have come down from planes alone. That's much different directive. That's saying, whatever you can, find a way to prove that was the cause,
right,
as opposed to what is the cause. And it's not a scientific approach, right?
Yeah.
So you give them a specific directive, and my guess is that there were probably a lot of really intrepid scientists in NIST that realized that the study they were doing was not scientific. And here's what's so spectacular. The entire kernel of their argument, like, can you show the scientific world the mathematical explanation of how the gravity of the buildings could make them fall that quickly? Can you please show it to us? They did not even do that. Instead, they referenced a 6-page scientific article that was written by an independent civil engineering professor from Northwestern University, who makes huge speculative jumps, internally inconsistent with NIST's estimates of the building's weight and other parameters, and they use that as the basis of their explanation. And you have to stop, as a person who's watching us talk about this, ask yourself, why would the greatest body of engineers and scientists decide not to actually do the calculation themselves? and, subcontract that to an independent researcher working all by himself with a student of his. And that is the mathematical basis for the NIST explanation. And this paper came out on September 13th, 2001, 2 days after 9/11. Somehow this professor had all the parameters of tensile strength, the mathematical model about how steel crumples, how much the building weighed. How did he know this? And how are we to accept that as an adequate foundation to an explanation that still should keep people mystified?
Yeah. It's fascinating too, because number of thoughts come to mind with what you said there. Initially, the people often have a disbelief that any group of scientists like those involved with NIST, or any organization that is government driven, something like the World Health Organization or the CDC, who in many ways is acquiring some of the best scientists out there. They think, well, why would these scientists do this? Why would they be part of this? Or, how much control can really be there? And, I think to two very recent examples, and one is William Thompson from the CDC, who came out and told everybody exactly how the CDC was lying to the public about vaccines, specifically the MMR vaccine and the research that was associated with that, and its impact on autism, and how I've actually have some information that I'm not allowed to share publicly with regards to William, and something that is just so damning to the CDC. It's unbelievable, and he will be releasing it soon once he retires, but it is heavy. Like, it would end this vaccine debate pretty quickly. But the point is there's a scientist who came out and said something, working for the CDC, saying we're being misled, and the CDC is forcing us to not put out the right results. And then not only that, but inside the CDC you have what they call the spider, which is a group of scientists that essentially they came out talking about how, as scientists, they've been suppressed to sharing proper information or accurate information, because the CDC is kind of strong-arming them and saying that your career will be over if you don't say what we want you to say. And so, there's a ton of evidence, there's a ton of whistleblowing that has happened that provides people that maybe it is time to open my mind and really think, did NIST do a proper job? And the other aspect to this that I think about relates so much to Julian Assange right now, who's currently on extradition trial, right?
Yes.
The media is not really covering it at all. The only coverage I've seen in mainstream media is the fact that they stopped the trial because Julian's lawyer needed to get a COVID test. Okay, that's the only importance here in this whole trial. Probably the biggest, most important trial ever. All they're talking about is his lawyer needs to get a COVID test. But it leads to the fact that journalists today in mainstream media are not journalists. They're not looking into the information like you did. Here you are, a human being first, right? An anesthesiologist by trade, and you look at this information and you come to very different conclusions than the people who are supposed to be doing this stuff for a living but aren't doing a good job. And it creates a public perspective of like, okay, so here I'm the media, I'm supposed to be telling everybody what the whole truth is, but they're not asking the important questions that you asked.
Oh, Joe, you again struck a very important point. In the end, the real indictment is going to be around the media. Like, why are they not, expressing our First Amendment rights to have a free press and ask the right questions to hold powers in check? What you said about Assange is very salient, because when you're trying to control, let's say, the narrative coming out of one of your trusted scientific institutions, yes, of course there is you lose your job if you don't say what we say. I mean, that is a threat, but it's not a very big threat, especially if you're dealing with like these kinds of issues. And there's also, the carrot, which is, you go along with what we're saying, we're going to give you a promotion. And interestingly, all of the lead investigators at NIST, got meritorious commendations and promotions and whatsoever. But I think the real, leverage point for getting a scientist to go along with a narrative that is not scientific is actually something different, and it's about Assange. I bet they probably were the powers that be talked to like the lead investigators and said, are you going to go out there really and tell your story that you're being coerced? Who is going to believe you?
Mm-hmm.
Look at Assange, look at Snowden. Like these people who are, whistleblowers are being treated like criminals.
Yeah.
And you're going to go challenge the US government and, uh, the whole narrative. It's like, it's like this, Joe. It's like, what if you saw a dragon, right? You saw it with your own eyes. Nobody can prove that there are no dragons,
Mm-hmm.
right? You cannot prove that hypothesis because there could be dragons, we just can't see them. How many times would people have to come out and say, I saw a dragon, I saw a dragon, and no one is going to believe it?
Yeah.
And that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about something that's harder to believe than seeing, a reptile flying around breathing fire. We're talking about, democracy. We're talking about freedom. And people are not going to believe that something like that could have ever been pulled off in a country like this.
Yeah.
And so I believe that's really, like why risk losing a promotion? Why risk losing your job? And even if you did come out,
Who's going to believe you? Yeah.
the lead investigator for the Building 7 collapse, his name is Shyam Sundar. He says something very, very interesting, right? When he was asked, like, did you look, was there any evidence of explosives? He says, no, there was no evidence. And then he was asked, did you look for any? And he said, no. We must, re-examine his response. He could have easily said, yeah, we looked and we couldn't find any. End of story. Oh, independent investigators found some, we don't believe them. We looked and we couldn't find any. Instead, he said, we didn't look.
Mm-hmm.
I think, I'm speculating, right? I think he's a good guy. He's an amazingly trained scientist. I forgot what his credentials are, but I think I'm at Sorbonne something. I think he was trying to tip his hat to us and say, look, guys, this is not a scientific investigation. We didn't look for, an alternative hypothesis. Don't you get it?
Yeah.
So I would like to grant him that, amount of, confidence that, maybe he's trying to let us know something. He was saying this was not science. We didn't look for an alternative hypothesis or evidence.
And it's fascinating too, because this whole idea of trusting, right? The research has been done. The study into what happened on 9/11 has been done. The professionals, if you will, have done this. And like we're seeing now so much is that we cannot trust what these organizations have ultimately come up with on a number of different issues, anything from policy making health studies to policy making environmental studies to war policy making events that have taken place that have completely changed the rights and freedoms of a lot of people. We can't trust it because we've had enough whistleblowers, we've had enough people say this isn't what they claim happened, didn't happen, or what this study said. Well, there's a whole bunch of evidence that this didn't actually happen. And I mean, you were talking about the dragon earlier, and you were talking about how many people got to see it before we start to either consider, listen, believe it, right? And I think what comes to mind for me is UFOs, right? UFOs is a great example of how it's a fringe topic. You're not allowed to talk about this. You're a wacko if you talk about it. Come 2018, 2019, right? You've had tens of thousands of reports in every country, every single year of people saying, I saw something, right? Yeah. Tons of anecdotal cases, which are anecdotal. And then now all of a sudden you have this admission, right?
Yeah.
And okay, yeah, they are real. We don't know who's driving them yet. We'll find out maybe down the road. There's been whistleblowers who have already let us know. But this is a perfect example of how we got to shift our relationship to information in society. And this is what your book is kind of talking about that's coming out soon, is this idea of we got to start getting into knowing ourselves, trusting ourselves, and being able to look at information without just believing what other people say.
Yes. You brought up so many amazing points there. The first is, like when we say, oh, I just want to believe what someone else says, I don't want to make up my mind, you actually are making a choice out of intuition or faith. Why do you choose that source amongst others? At some point, you have to realize that you are actually having some element of faith or intuition, because there's no reason for you to believe this or believe that. So ultimately, you are making the choice based on a feeling, not necessarily objectivity. The second thing you brought up was whistleblower, right? Who determines whether someone is a whistleblower or a kook?
Mm-hmm.
You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's the media. If the media decides to lionize someone, they become one thing, and on the other hand, if they get condemned, they're now the conspiracy kook theorist that should never be believed under any circumstances. So, and this, again, goes to fact checking. Who are the fact checkers? Mm-hmm. But ultimately, the narrative is being constructed by the media. Now, let's go back to this is another really great point, okay? UFOs, dragons, how many times is it going to take? Here's what's really fascinating. And again, instead of going like the facts, like I proclaim this is a fact or that's the fact, look at the equations. Let us say that in our society, there is the concept of dragon viewing or UFOs. You've seen a UFO. Now, if it's just a myth and there is no advantage or disadvantage to subscribing to it, we would imagine that the percentage of people that believe in this myth would pretty much stay constant. There's no reason, for it to change. On the other hand, if there is some repercussion for proclaiming that you believe in a dragon or whatever, and people make fun of you and you get lambasted in social media, you would imagine that if it's a myth, the popularity of that belief would eventually start to decline. Mm-hmm. There's no incentive to believe it. You get crushed. So what then should we make of the fact that despite the endless attack that conspiracy theorists or UFO believers, dragon seers, what are we supposed to make of the fact that despite this kind of attack, they seem to be growing in number?
Yeah.
You have to avail yourself of the fact that maybe it's not actually a myth.
Yeah.
That's just what it is.
100%. And, it's like the same goes with and I hate to get super controversial, but the vaccine community, it's the same thing, right? Like we've been covering that topic for, a really long period of time. I mean, I'd love to hear your perspective as an anesthesiologist in the medical community a little bit on this, if you're open to sharing it. But, it's essentially like you have, to me, this whole thing began with, people like to say, oh, it all happened with Andy Wakefield. It's like, no, it didn't. First of all, but yes, he was part of saying, there's something weird going on here. And if you actually watch the tapes of Andy talking to government about this, he doesn't say what the media said that he said. All he really said was, take the MMR vaccine, break it up into 3 doses and give each dose individually. Do not give it as one. If you do, it's a disaster. And they turned it into, he's an anti-vaxxer. But he actually said, no, give the vaccines, just break them up, right? Yeah. And, so on and so forth, right? The rest of the story. But this whole vaccine thing, it came from anecdotal cases of parents going, I got my kid the vaccine, and now there's something like really wrong. I don't know what it is yet, but there's something wrong. And this just built and built and built and built. And it's almost as if the medical community that's kind of really opposed to these ideas and the media are trying to pretend that these people don't exist, and that these loving parents that are concerned, that have seen something happen, that are growing in huge numbers, they're ignoring them. What other thing in society would we ignore a person saying, hey guys, someone's being hurt here? Why
Or,
only
or
this subject?
don't know what to say. Okay. So I went to medical school, right?
Yeah,
We, talked about the immune system for semesters. It's a very, very complicated system of coordinated, cellular and humoral responses to antigens, things that invade your body. We probably talked about vaccines for like an hour.
yeah,
You see what we don't know. We understand as physicians, oh yeah, it's an attenuated form of a virus that your body can quickly defeat and it learns how to identify it, and that's how they work. That's pretty much all we learn as medical students, right? Now we have these directives coming from the CDC that say, okay, you need to tell your patients that their kids need to be vaccinated at this age, that age, with this MMR, HPV, this whole slew of things. So we have these guidelines that are coming from an institution like the CDC. Here's what happens. If you're a pediatrician and you realize that there's a lot of, ambiguity about how these things work and the safety of it, if you don't tell your patients or the parents of the children that they should be vaccinated, you've now stepped outside the paradigm. You are now no longer following CDC guidelines. Okay? What happens if this kid gets the measles? You have no grounds to stand on legally because you veered away from the paradigm. So it's not so hard, to see that that's how they can get, 15,000 pediatricians or however many there are to do what they say, because that's the basis of our protection if something goes wrong. And this led to the third thing I was going to say about vaccination. So you make an excellent point, right? Which is, look, there are parents out there that are saying that I went in with my bubbly 2-year-old and I got a series of vaccinations that were recommended. I was told that there may be some side effects, some fever. As soon as the child got the needle, something went wrong. He started screaming like I've never heard him scream before. He got a fever to 105. I didn't know what to do. The fever finally broke, and when it did, the child was different, right? We have so many anecdotal stories like this. What do we make of it? Well, we know that these parents have gone back and said, look, something happened to my child after the vaccine. Could it be the vaccine? And they get looked at like, they're just making things up. That never happens. So as an anesthesiologist, okay, like I have given medicines to what are supposed to be safe medicines to people in the operating room, like, an antibiotic right before surgery. And then 2 minutes later, I'm resuscitating them from cardiovascular collapse. They had like a tremendously horrible reaction to what was supposed to be a safe intervention. So for someone to come in and say, oh, that never happens with vaccinations, that's absurd, you're anti-vax, that is actually an absurd position to hold. There's 8 billion people with 8 different billion kinds of chemistry, and we have this one intervention that we think is going to be safe for everybody. That doesn't hold any validity in my world. It happens.
yeah,
Right? When people are coming from the conventional perspective and say, look, it's been proven that they're safe, you cannot make that proof. All you can do is look at a number of people and say, you know what, the incidence of autism in the people who got the intervention compared to those who did not are about the same, therefore it's safe. That is not actually a proof of this model at all. If you really want to prove it, you should have no incidences of autism following a vaccination. Because as soon as you have one, you have proof that there's a possibility that there is a relationship. And this is, it just blows my mind because we're taught over and over in medical school, listen to your patients, listen to your patients. That's the most important thing. Listen to their story.
yeah.
And we're our ears are deaf to parents who say, look, I know it was the vaccine.
Yeah. And you know, and it probably relates a lot to, you know, doctors having fear too about, you know, what it could lead to if they were to question this, which goes back to societal control, which I do want to get into a little bit, but I want to say one thing, and you might be able to add to this, both from your training, but potentially culture too. I'm going to throw it out there. You know, I've researched that about 10 to 15% of people, this is based on a number of scientific studies sort of combined, are likely going to have an adverse reaction to vaccines that is going to be fairly serious. So what they're trying to say is vaccines can't be a one-size-fits-all medication, which is common. Most medications are not one-size-fits-all. You always have a percentage of the population that can't have them. And unfortunately, we're not really testing whether or not someone is going to have an adverse reaction. We're just kind of doing it. Now, if you look at penicillin, which is something that, you know, people wear the bracelet. This person can't have penicillin, they'll have a really bad reaction, this is not good. So we've created a bracelet that people wear and a culture that says you can't give this, and they make up about 7 to 8% of the population. So now you have up to double that, you know, this is based on some of the research, up to double that can't have vaccines. And we're pretending that, well, you know, they're just anti-vaxxers, right? Which is a very interesting observation. And the interesting part of it comes down to, like you said, everybody's unique, 8 billion people, unique. Precision medicine is often discussed as the future of modern medicine, right? We get to a point where we can be so precise with each individual patient that we can treat them based on their unique physiology, biochemistry, issues, so on and so forth, which is fantastic. That's where we're headed, precision medicine. Over in the East, right, and this is where you might have a cultural, like you might have some experience with this, is, you know, it's normal for there to be a more precise approach when, you know, Indians, when like Chinese, those types of medicine will bring forth this idea of what's your unique physiology and how do I treat it? Well, hold on a second. That sounds similar to precision medicine, which is where we're headed. So if the East is doing it and the West says they're all crazy, yet the West wants to create precision medicine, it basically illustrates that the West knows deep down that the East is right. They want to go there, but they can't admit that what they're currently doing doesn't make a lot of sense.
You're right. You're right. You know, but you know, again, in that you know position you're making, is that we're assuming that's where they want to go.
Yeah,
You know,
that's true too. There is a lot of discussion around it, but whether it's actually going to go there is another question.
that's right. Well, you know, this brings up let's say we have a precision medicine model.
Yeah,
We have to expect that that will take an incredible amount of research in order to get to that place. And it also means that we would have to like reformulate our doses based on this person's specific physiology. That, of course, is going to be pretty expensive.
yeah,
So it's going to cost. So going back to vaccines for a second, up to 1988, in this country, there was only about 12 or 14 recommended vaccinations, you know, through your childhood. And then we now have about 54. That's what the CDC recommends, you know, up by a factor of 4.5. So you know where I'm going with this, right? What happened in that period? Well, in 1986, in this country, we've indemnified vaccine manufacturers
yeah,
from any kind of legal action against untoward reactions from their product.
yeah,
So again, you know, this is another way to approach this for people who label people anti-vax or, you know, nut jobs. Why would it be necessary to protect the vaccine manufacturers if their vaccines were safe?
right.
How do you reconcile that?
Yeah.
So, you know, again, this is another place where you can place some uncertainty into the narrative. It's like, what, you know, you don't have to believe everything that we're saying, but why have we structured our legal system like that? If they were safe, there would be no reason to protect them, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And why are the vaccines up now suddenly? So there's a lot to this. And again, it always comes back to why should you believe the alternative version versus the conventional one? And so these are the hooks, you know, the internal inconsistencies of the conventional narrative that need to be explored.
Yeah. Yeah, and jumping back to 9/11 for a moment, because I mean, we start getting into, for example, when you were just saying off the vaccines there, or, protecting industry, so on and so forth, those are policy changes. And when we look at 9/11, and we look at the policy changes that came as a result, people would ask the question, what's the motivation? Why would there, if what you guys are saying is true, and that there's a potentiality that not only did NIST not investigate this properly, but that there's more to the story, and we're kind of not being told that, what would be the motivation behind creating an event like this? Now, I don't know if you have any perspectives on that, but we do know that a lot of policy changed following 9/11 that deeply affected the citizens of the United States, and I mean many in the rest of the world too as a result.
Mhm. Well, I believe you're right. For the longest time, once I was convinced that it's not what we were told, we want to identify motive. And the very first assumption I made was that, oh, it was all about rejuvenating the America's military, machine to make profits for the warmongers, the weapons manufacturers. And then, this leads to another question, is that who is really making the money? And, it's another really, really deep rabbit hole, but, honestly, it is our central banking system, whenever debt is created, is creating a huge amount of windfall in the form of commercial bank deposits that we need $2 trillion to fight a war in Afghanistan, let's say. This is debt that's being created. It goes into the hands of the weapons manufacturers and the military, and then they deposit it into commercial banks. And that is a system of creating a huge amount of wealth. So even more deeply. So now you've got the people building bombs, you've got the banking system that's reaping the benefits. But I do actually agree with you, Joe. I think it has to do with control. I think it has to do with policy. We all know that the Patriot Act was, all written, ready to be signed, within months or perhaps even weeks after that kind of event. And we lost a lot of liberties. In fact, we lost more than we realized. And the people who are bringing light to this kind of stuff are being criminalized. So, I mean, we have to just stop for a second and say, why are we condemning the whistleblowers? What have we done here exactly?
And you mentioned to dive into this, because I think this is kind of the crux of personally what I enjoy talking about, and where I think we can kind of get the most, well, hey, what do I do as a human being now? In your upcoming book, we were talking just beforehand a little bit about what the idea of woke, right? Because the book's titled Woke, an anesthesiologist's view, and the word woke, which has become very popular, right? You mentioned there was a Buddhist perspective, what the Buddha had said about what it is, the mind free of delusion, I believe were the words that you used. And when I think about in the one of the ways that I try to explain things, I say that we're all, as humanity, believing, not all of us, but we're in a journey of waking up from the fact that we've been believing in an illusion. We've been believing in a world, not from a quantum physics point of view, that isn't real, right? So that everything is really energy, like that's part of it. But just in a straight, everyday societal point of view, how the government functions, what does our voting really do? How does money work? How does the economy function? We believe in a story around all that simply isn't true, and that we're breaking that illusion. And what would you say, I guess, about this whole idea, this arrival of wokeness, if you will, which is a very complex topic, as it relates to all of this?
Well, so it is a popular term, but it's also a very unpopular term. Mm-hmm. Now it's being overused, and it is being used, it's being co-opted. The word woke is being co-opted to garner support for your view as being superior. And the word now is causing division. Whereas I believe true wokeness, far be it from me to have all the answers, but originally it brought people together under a common idea that when free of delusion, a mind suffers less. And what's interesting about the Buddha, for example, and that's how it was attributed to him. He was, who are you? I'm no one. I'm awake. That's how the term woke actually came about. He listened to doctrines. He was out trying all these different kinds of esoteric wisdom practices for 6 years, and realized that they were all missing the mark. And he, if you believe in the story, he was able to see that actually the truth comes from within, not from without. And so here we are in a society where we can find anyone to support us, no matter how outrageous your opinion is. You put that in, you're going to find someone that agrees with you. And so we have to take a look at this. It's like, we claim that we all, have individual truths and that all need to be honored. Really? You really think that there are 8 billion versions of reality that are all true? Mm-hmm. Or are we just utterly confused because we refuse to acknowledge the uncertainty in our position? And that's what I believe, is happening right here, is that because we can't acknowledge the uncertainty behind our opinions, we cannot see the full picture.
Yep.
Right. So that is the essence of the book. And was there another question there? I'm sorry if I got lost in my.
I'm not 100% sure if there was, because I was just engaged in what you were sharing there. But to add on to it and to kind of just keep going with it is just this idea that this being able to look at, and this is a very, very important time for this message, for what you're going to be talking about in your book, for just this conversation in general, which is, let's say we have a mainstream perspective, which, is, say, built on an illusion. Hey, this isn't quite happening how we thought. Where people are starting now in droves, millions of people are starting to question, they're starting to realize, the government doesn't quite operate the way I thought. There's more corruption than I realized. Corporations are manipulating things. Oh my God, I don't know what's true anymore, right? I don't know what's a quote unquote conspiracy and what's not. I don't know what has an agenda and what doesn't, right? And yet, as people are asking those questions, they join what is often called that conspiracy community, or however you want to talk about it, right? And within this, what I'm observing is a build of a new ideology, which is that, the bad guys are always the bad guys, and their hands are in everything, and every single thing that happens is a conspiracy, and and everything is said so matter-of-factly. And you just said something, which is to be able to admit the uncertainty in our position. And I wanted to share a little story to which you can kind of go off of here, which is just this idea of just a few months ago there was an interview between Brian Rose and David Icke, and they were discussing kind of the early what's going on with COVID and relation to 5G, and everybody was watching this, and I decided to watch it because everybody's saying, hey, you got to check this out, you got to check this out, and I watched it being shared like crazy. And when I finished watching it, I said, you know what? One, I didn't overly enjoy the interview, but I thought to myself, this is a huge problem. And the reason why I thought it was a huge problem was because it made an incredible amount of assertions about something that was going to create a huge opportunity within what you can call the mainstream media, what you can call the mainstream fact-checking world, to which they were now going to take something that had some nuggets of truth, but also a lot of things that were being presented as true, which were not true. And it was going to give them an opportunity to basically just shut out any, dissenting COVID perspectives and even dissenting 5G safety perspectives. And to me, I saw all of that sharing as this ideologically driven perspective, where people are seeing what he's saying matches what I believe about how the world works. I'm not really taking a position. I'm a free being, right? And I'm going to utilize and understand my reality moment by moment, as opposed to what he's saying matches my ideology, therefore it's great. And I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as a lead in to what you feel about this.
Well, look, I know exactly what you're talking about with that interview. There were assertions made that should not have been assertions. And, this is what a little shout out to you guys at Collective Evolution. I think that you are one of the few platforms out there that realize the responsibility you have in the information that you share. It's never polemic. You're never screaming at people that says you must believe this or you must believe that. Because, if we're going to get metaphysical here, there's a certain amount of responsibility, karmically, if you want, or ethically, when you are spreading information, as a guru or just someone who's asking people to look at a different narrative or information. When you are, when one is expressing another way of looking at things, a teaching, if you will,
yeah,
for someone to accept or deny. If you're wrong about that, you're incurring a great deal of responsibility by misleading your readers or your listeners or whoever's listening to this right now. Please understand, like we're dealing with paradigms, we're dealing with uncertainty here. We're trying to look at everything openly. And here's the thing, Joe, right? You take an average person and you give them two versions, like two facts. Do you believe this fact or this fact? We can imagine that half the people are going to get it right and half the people are going to get it wrong. Just like what version you want to believe. On the other hand, you present them a paradigm that has 50 different elements to it. This, and this. Half of them are false and half of them are true. It is going to be the rare individual that can pick out all of the falsehoods from all of the factual statements.
Yeah.
So what we have now are these mixed bags of information. You refer to the London Real interview that David Icke gave, and I know what you're referring to. He makes the assertion that COVID is just a figment of our imagination, and it's actually 5G that's causing all of the illnesses out there. That is a bold assumption and a bold assertion to make. And, for anyone who missed what you're saying there, that's all it takes for everyone to throw his entire argument out.
Yeah.
A person would make, why should I believe anything else he says? So that's really, I think, a huge misstep on his part.
Yeah. And I think where this leads to for me is some people will say, and this is kind of the challenge, is like, well, but free speech, we should be able to say whatever we want and not be penalized. And I'm like, yeah, I'm 100% with you on that. Nobody should be censored. Nobody should have their stuff removed. However, and this is what I pose to people, I said, what's your end goal in sharing this information? Oh, well, we want to wake people up. Great, right? So what do you want to wake people up to and why? Well, I want them to see the truth of the world. Okay, great. Why? Well, because I want to create a better world where there isn't a group of people manipulating people. That's fantastic. Okay, so where does the vast majority of people exist in their perspective? And they say, well, they're, people say asleep. They're asleep. Oh, okay, right. So they're asleep. So what would be the best way, if that's your audience and you believe they're asleep and that you believe that they believe the mainstream perspective, if you were a wise individual with a piece of information and said, how do I convey this information to these people? You would probably say, I need to speak in a language they understand. I need to do things in terms they understand. I need to relate to them in ways that they understand. Am I going to get further if I'm insulting them or if I'm sitting with them as a heart-to-heart human being having a conversation? And I think this is where the challenge is so many people, and I'm not trying to judge people here, I'm just trying to create an observation, but a lot of us in this community we're not using the wisdom, the responsibility, if you will, like you said, of having information and saying, if my goal is to wake people up, as we like to say, right, then why not meet them where they're at and share with them in an effective manner? Am I going to go give a speech to a whole bunch of people who only understand Spanish in English? No, I'm going to probably learn as much Spanish as I can or bring a translator so that I can convey my message accurately. And this is an important piece to the puzzle that I believe people, when starting to get truths themselves, is learn how can I effectively share this with my audience. And what I felt watching that interview was, yes, David was sharing things that he felt was true, but when you go about it in that manner, you're literally asking for a mainstream community to completely throw out everything.
Not gonna
And
happen.
and I'm just questioning, and not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying, is that the right thing, or is that I say is that right thing to do, but is that the wisest thing to do? That's my question.
Yeah, it's not. It isn't the wisest thing to do. What I would like to add there is, beyond avoiding that sort of confrontation, you either are awake or asleep, you believe me or you don't.
Right.
There's another element to this, which is often misconstrued or poorly communicated, that there's a general feeling that if you believe in the alternative version of things, you're fear mongering,
Right.
some dystopian view of the world. There has to be an incentive to drop your paradigm,
Yes.
right? It's not just like, I want to be protected, so when they come for me, I'm going to be ready. No, the kinds of things that we're discussing here are actually unbelievably hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and we've forgotten what our potential, in my opinion,
Yeah.
is, right? We actually live in a world of abundance,
Yeah.
just a fabrication that we don't have enough. We actually live in a world of unbelievably cooperative people.
Mm-hmm.
But we're being told that, we need to build a wall. We have to protect ourselves from those guys. So we're headed towards a completely different paradigm that is way more positive. Imagine if we woke up in the morning and realized that 99.999% of us are loving human beings.
Yeah.
The narrative is being controlled by the tiniest fraction of people. So, what we're really talking about, not that we know the answer, but the potential
Yeah.
of something amazing is in front of us.
Yeah. 100%. And it feels as though it's like there's this crucial time of really asking ourselves that question of like, what is that potential? What does it look like? What does it feel like? Are we moving towards that in what actions we're taking today? And really asking the questions, because people, and I'd love to hear your experience on this too. It's now, since you started questioning 9/11, you said in 2017. So here we are, say 3.5 some odd years. I'd love to hear your perspective on some of the interactions you've had. But, for me, in doing collective evolution for 11 years, a lot of people assume that, all family interactions, all friend interactions are people getting mad at me when I share a perspective with them. And I'm like, no, that doesn't happen, because I approach them like a loving individual, understanding that their position's their position. And I have a different position that can be fluid, can move, can shift, and I'm always just sharing what I feel is something that can help us move towards a world where we can create a more thriving society. And I have those types of interactions, and I don't get this backlash. Yet I hear a lot of people where it's like every day all they're getting is backlash and fighting and online commenting wars, and everybody online who disagrees with them must be a troll, right? But the question is your approach truly leading towards your end goal? Or is your approach creating more division, more fighting, more issues? And I'd love to hear, like, have you had like an overwhelming amount of just negative interactions with people, or have you been able to maintain a lot of respect amongst people, even sharing different ideas?
Well, this is where, I acknowledge you, because you've been doing this longer than I have. You know what I'm saying? And this is also probably the reason why I decided to write a book as opposed to run a conscious media platform, because I, you know, I'm still, I have not been able to, I'm always amazed by how you offer something to your audience, because it's like, wow, that was really very kind of Joe to put it that way. And I'm learning from you. And to answer your question, I've brought people to a place of questioning kindly, and I've also faced a lot of resistance. It is not easy.
Mm-hmm.
It is not easy to come forward with these kinds of ideas, especially in the scientific community. I feel like the biggest laggards in this are going to be the ones that are in science. You
Yes.
know, we've forgotten as scientists. You know, I've been through these institutions. I have been indoctrinated and indoctrinated, if there's such a word. You know, I get it. I see how people actually think they know what they're talking about, but they really do not.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the hardest ones you know, they believe in a doctrine. You know, it's pure dogma.
Yeah.
How can I believe you if my institutions don't believe that? I mean, that's pure dogmatic thinking,
Yeah.
right? Um, so yeah, that's it. I'm definitely, you know, I've wasted a lot of energy in that sense, but you know, on people and getting into conflicts, and I'm learning how to interact better. You know, you have to be ready to hear something.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how cogent your argument is, how well you articulate it. You know, if you're not ready to hear that,
Yeah.
it's going to go right over you.
For sure. But I guess the interesting part of that is like sometimes there's people like people will say, well, so you convert everybody you talk to, and it's like, no, no, no. It's like, you know, some people we leave disagreeing about whatever it is that we were having a discussion about. However, it's like there, like they said, there's you were saying there's the questioning, there is the I am, you know, I hear what you're saying, I don't agree with it, I, you know, most of the time it's I just don't agree that the government would be doing that, sort of thing, you know. That's kind of where it goes, like I understand where you're coming from but I don't agree, or yeah, there's corruption, and that's kind of just where it stops, right? The vaccine argument is a great one because like you know, it's obviously coming to head right now, and you know, a lot of aluminum. I just had this discussion with someone the other day that, you know, the common thing is, why are you worried about aluminum in vaccines? It's in our food, and it's like, well, you have scientists who are saying, you know, we consume more in our food, and it's like, you don't understand the argument here. This isn't a nanoparticle of aluminum is not the same as what's in your food. When you inject aluminum, it's not the same as when you ingest and goes through the digestive process. These are two completely different processes. And what it reveals is the lack of understanding, just like you said, from a lot of people in science, that they don't understand what the actual argument is. And I've often said, and you know, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too. It's I don't want to paint all scientists with a single brush. I don't think that's fair to do to anybody in any case. But what I've observed a lot is that you could suggest that the scientific community at times, the ones who are very dogmatic, are almost, I'm going to say, more stuck than some religious people. And
Yes.
the reason for that is there's the same dogmas involved. However, on the scientific side, there's an added, I want to say like arrogance, if you will, or position that states, but my position can't be based on faith and dogma because it is a fact.
Right.
And that little detail makes it a lot more, they get a lot more stuck in the belief system.
Right. Yes, it is, you know, that's what's so scary about it, right? Because it was you know, it was the birth of scientific thought in between 1500 and, you know, 1650, you know, the Renaissance that launched us out of this dark age.
Yeah.
And we have sadly lost our way. We now it's a doctrine. Science is now a doctrine. You know, there's an incredible amount of bias in publications of scientific papers. You know, people who are supposed to know exactly what's going on actually do not. They refer to other people. Here's the thing, Joe. Like, intelligence now is no longer the ability to discern the information. Intelligence has now become the ability to discern which source to believe.
Mm-hmm.
How could you believe that source? You need to go to the Times. You're an idiot. I'm smart. I go to the Washington Post. That's what we've become.
Right.
And much different than what intelligence used to be, where we had independent thinking. No, so this is why it's important, I think, to bring up things in new ways.
Hmm.
Right? We talked about, like asking the question, why didn't NIST look for explosives?
Yeah.
Huge question. Here's another interesting question, right? Um, my editor of the book, he's in the media, and he had such a hard time reading my book because he thought that I was making incredible leaps, which when I actually wasn't, and he just can't buy it at all. And he's like, Madhava, look, hold on a second, Madhava, answer me this question. Everywhere I look, no expert is throwing their arms about 9/11 saying, I just don't understand it. There's too many odd things. You either have people who defend it completely or attack it completely. How come there are no people shrugging their shoulders? And I said, you are absolutely right. That's a really good question. Why is there no one saying that, wow, I don't know? There's only two possibilities. One is that the 9/11 truth movement, or, the over 3,000 engineers that are challenging the conventional narrative, are completely off their rocker. They're unhinged. They've been seduced by conspiracy theory. The other possibility is that all of the experts that come out in support of NIST are being paid off, but the third possibility is that the people who are coming forward to challenge the official narrative have actually read the NIST documents, and the ones that are supporting the conventional narrative actually have not.
Right.
Right? The fact that there is no sort of middle ground about this among the experts should ask us to pause and say, wait, how could there be no middle ground?
Yeah.
What's going on here, right? So this is an indirect way of exploring this idea. If it truly was nebulous, there should be a lot of experts saying, God, I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
But we don't have that. We have a tremendous polarity between experts. What's the explanation for that?
Yeah. And that's an interesting question. I would almost, if for within my own thoughts, look for more clarity on the two sides, because I'm thinking to myself, I feel as though in some of the scientists that I've spoken to who've questioned it, like even speaking with yourself, it sounds like you're kind of like, I don't know the full story of what happened, but I do know that these things don't make sense. I do know that it seems like there's explosives here. Like, we do need to investigate this. Like, I did an interview with Richard Gage, who is the founder there of 9/11, the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth. And the position I got from him is, I don't know what happened on that day for sure, but here's what I can say. And you look at the studies that have come out of University of Alaska at Fairbanks studying controlled demolition of Building 7. They've spent a lot of years looking at that. And that professor who's kind of been leading up that project, he's like, hey guys, I don't know what happened, but I do know that fires for sure, guaranteed, here's all the models, did not bring down that building. And the only explanation based on all of the physics is a controlled demolition. That's all I can tell you, right? And so I feel like that's from my perspective, that's kind of like a middle ground. Would you have something to sort of add to what you mean about the polarity?
So let me clarify that. What you said is absolutely correct. And what I mean by this polarity is that the people who are challenging the narrative are very confident, not in knowing the full picture, but knowing what didn't happen.
Ah.
You know what I'm saying? It's like that large document called the 9/11 Commission Report and supporting this documents, that is false.
Right.
You don't know what happened, but that's false. That's what I mean by the polarity.
Right. As opposed to perhaps there's some truths within that, so to speak.
As opposed to, well, look, that whole thing can be condensed into one sentence, which is, how did the buildings fall from planes? Well, we don't know, but because they fell from planes, they must have fell from planes. what that document says.
Yeah.
So I believe the polarity is around that statement. There are a group of scientists that have actually read it and said, "Holy cow! I can't believe that's what the document says, and that's not right." Whereas there's another group of experts that look at it and say, "Oh no, it's right. No, it could have happened. It could have happened." That's where the polarity lies. You see what I'm
Right.
saying? Yeah.
Yep. Yep.
There's tremendous amount of uncertainty. Here's what's interesting, Joe, is that the people who are challenging the 9/11 narrative, they know that's not right. We have no idea who did it.
Right.
Honestly, I mean, you can make suppositions.
Right.
The people who believe the conventional narrative have not even looked at the science, but they know who did it. Absolutely, it was those 19 guys with box cutters. We know
Right.
that.
Right. Their passport
Right?
survived.
Yeah, we know that the plane was vaporized,
Yeah.
but the Saudi passports were intact. Why don't they make the planes out of the passports
That's what
material?
I was thinking, right? Because every other passport in the world is made of just regular paper that's laminated, but those are made from a space age material that humanity still doesn't quite understand. so that's how they survived. But questioning.
Aside too much.
Yeah. So a couple of the key strong takeaways from this for me, and if you want to check out the article that Madhava had written about this, specifically to 9/11, there'll be a link in the description that you can have a peek at it to really kind of get into some of the facts and the details that we didn't cover in this video, because there's a lot of important stuff that we really can look at when it comes to 9/11 that gives us a different perspective on what's happening just from a factual point of view, from a scientific point of view. Because we learned in this interview that the NIST report is not really a scientific approach to what took place. It's a scientific approach based on a specific sort of, if we're looking only at planes having taken down the buildings, then I want you to look at it from this point of view. And that's essentially what was given to the scientists that were working on the NIST report. They weren't really allowed to examine what, from a big picture perspective, actually happened. So the article goes into that very, very well. At the same time, one of the other key takeaways here for me was really this idea, this probably, I think I said it a whole bunch of times in this interview, just how important it is right now to be able to look at multiple positions and really think about how we're communicating different ideas to people. I see a lot going on right now with the way we're almost, from a perspective of a community of people that are questioning things, we're literally begging sometimes for fact checkers to take down information, for censorship to take place, because the approach that we're taking to putting out information has little and sometimes absolutely no standards whatsoever in terms of creating a factual piece of information, or in clearly identifying that, hey, what we're talking about here is just a theory, and that's okay to talk about that. And from my perspective, I've very, very, very seldom seen information completely removed from the internet when it is presented as merely a theory and merely we're not sure what happened, but this may have happened. The only time I've ever seen that en masse is with the film Plandemic. But prior to that film, I've never seen someone who's just putting out a theory, putting out thoughts and ideas completely removed from the internet, because it's important that is part of the conversation, that we're literally using our wisdom, using our understanding of the world that we live in today, and understanding that there is censorship, and saying, okay, how can I best get around, if you will, that censorship by putting forth a well thought out post or argument, or a well thought out contribution to the dialogue. And unfortunately, from my observation, that isn't being done as much as we like to think that it is being done. So I wanted to talk about that a lot in this interview, because I think it's one of the big, powerful shifts that is happening and will continue to happen over the coming years as people do question a lot more of what's going on. This emergence of being able to look at this information from a really critical and high standard point of view is what's going to change a lot of what's going on in the world, when we can bring about discussions, much in the way you see some of the people who are having a lot of success right now in bringing about change. Like someone who comes to mind right off the top of my head is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's taking a really great approach to this. And while every now and then he gets bashed in the media, he hasn't been completely deleted. He hasn't been completely shut out. And the primary reason for that is his approach is not attacking anybody, and his approach is very factually driven. He does not make claims that are not backed by some form of evidence, and he's not making wide sweeping claims that literally have no backing whatsoever. So I think this is an important reflection piece for us. Should we really be looking at information in this particular way and talking about it in this particular manner? I believe it's a shift that we can really begin to make. The final thing, if you want to check out our deeper discussion that Madhava and I had on the COVID aspect of this whole discussion, especially from a point of view of a medical doctor, then head on over to CETV.1 and you can check out the rest of this interview. CETV is the streaming platform that we've built so that we can share a lot of this type of content. Obviously, we've been demonetized as a company for sharing these types of perspectives over the past little while, and we have had to create our own platforms in order to keep things alive and keep things going. So head on over to CETV.1, become a member, support our work, and check out the rest of this interview. Thanks for watching.